Hi everyone, my name is Mitch and I'm with the St. Paul Center for Biblical Theology. And welcome back to another one of our weekday reflections on the daily Mass readings. Today is Monday, November 23rd, and the Gospel reading today is from Luke chapter 21, verses 1 to 4. Now, today's Gospel is small in size, but great in importance. It's only 4 verses long, but it packs quite a punch. Today's Gospel is really a story, I think, if you boil it down. It's a story about heroic generosity. It answers the question, what does God really want from us? And it's a story about giving everything to God in response to that call, in response to that desire. It's about giving everything to God without holding back, without begrudging the gift, and without concern for what others are doing. Okay, it's something very personal in your relationship with the Lord. So let's see what Jesus has to say. This is Luke 21, beginning in verse 1. Jesus looked up and saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw a poor widow putting in 2 copper coins. And he said, "Truly I tell you, this poor widow has put in more than all of them. For they all contributed out of their abundance, but she, out of her poverty, put in all the living that she had." So let's just set the scene here. Let's kind of put ourselves into this scene so we can hear what Jesus is saying and learn what he wants to teach us. The first thing to notice here is that Jesus is in the temple and he's talking about people putting money in the treasury. Well, from the first century historian Josephus, who gives us the most detailed description of the Herodian temple as it existed in Jerusalem in the first century, tells us that there were at least 12 different receptacles throughout the temple complex where money could be given to the sanctuary, right? Where donations could be made, all right? And why would somebody make donations to the temple? This, by the way, we're not talking here about the annual temple tax. There is something called a half shekel tax that every Israelite family had to contribute to for the upkeep of the temple. But here we're talking about voluntary offerings, donations of free will, so to speak. And what are they for? Why does one make an offering to the temple? Why does one drop a coin into one of these receptacles? Well, it's to support the ministries that take place there. It's to support the ministry of worship, all right? So that God is properly honored as the covenant determines, all right, as the covenant requires. And so there was a constant need, or you might say a need for a constant supply of animals that had to be sacrificed literally every day, twice a day. A lamb was offered in what's called the daily tamid offering in the morning and the evening. Wine had to be purchased because there were libations or drink offerings that were made every day in the temple. And grains had to be procured because there were memorial offerings and cereal offerings that were also made on a daily basis in the temple. And so when you're donating to the temple and you're putting your coin in this receptacle, you're supporting the worship of the one true God. You're keeping the covenant ministries of sacrifice, prayer, and worship going on a daily basis. So that's where they're at. They're in the temple, and this is where the woman is putting her coins. Now, who is this woman? Jesus doesn't call her by name, but he refers to her as a widow. That's a significant little detail because widows are among the most vulnerable people in ancient societies and in ancient Israel, no less than in others. And I think it might even be significant that Jesus refers to her as a poor widow. Why would that be significant? Because, well, for one thing, there was no such thing as a rich widow in the ancient world because widows were without support. They didn't have a woman who no longer had a husband, no longer had an income. Okay, and so to say that this widow was poor is to say that she was on the brink of destitution, you might say. Okay, and this was a real issue. In the synagogue, for example, they had a procedure, they had a program in place to supply for the widows of the congregation of Israel. And then this was mimicked in the early church Okay, if you remember from Acts chapter 6, there's something called the daily distribution, where the earliest Christians were distributing funds, resources, goods, foods, whatever, to the widows and orphans of the early Christian community. All right? In fact, in the book of James, we are told something remarkable about service to widows. We are told that religion that is pure and undefiled before God and the Father is to visit or care for widows and orphans in their affliction and to keep oneself unstained by the world. So widows are persons in great need, but they're also persons that are very close to the heart of God. So we're at the treasury at one of these receptacles. We're in the temple, and a poor widow puts in 2 copper coins. What are these 2 copper coins? In Luke's gospel, which we're reading today, they are called 2 lepta. And a leptos was the least valuable coin in circulation in Israel in the first century. Okay, you may have heard gospel stories where Jesus refers to a denarius. A denarius is 1 day's wage for a field laborer or a vineyard worker. Okay, a leptos was 120. You needed 128 lepta to equal 1 denarius, 1 day's wage. So we're talking about something that if you converted it into modern terms, it would be roughly, somewhere between a penny and a nickel. Okay? So what is this woman giving, donating to the temple? This poor widow who's nearly destitute gives maybe 3 to 5 cents to the temple, which is hardly anything. And yet Jesus surprises his disciples and those who are listening to him in the temple by valuing her donation above all the others that are being put in there by those who are, as Luke says, are rich, okay, and who are giving out of their surplus. What's the lesson in this gospel? What is Jesus trying to teach us? Well, the first thing I think we would say is that it's a lesson in sacrifice. Okay, one thing that I try to remind my kids of, and myself of, from time to time, is that sacrifice is not giving of yourself or giving of your resources until you feel good. Sacrifice is giving until it hurts a little bit. That's the essence of sacrifice, where you're giving beyond what is comfortable, beyond just what makes you feel good. All right, and in this particular case, we don't have to confine this to money. The story tells us about 2 copper coins, but we could also talk about the talents that God has given you. Are you giving them back to him? We could talk about the time that God has given you. Are you giving to him of your time? And also, of course, of your resources and your treasures. And the key thing, I think, to notice here is that it's not about, as Jesus is talking about this woman and praising her gift, her offering to the Lord, it's not about the amount that she gives in comparison to others. It's about the amount that you give in comparison to what God has given you. All right? This is that deeply personal component to this. God has given you a select amount of time. He's given you a unique set of gifts and talents in your own life that he wants you to use. He has given you a unique set of resources that you can use to support yourself, but also then to give back to him. And it's about what you give to God in relation, not to what others are giving, but to what God has given to you. The second thing, I think, is that the widow in the Gospel of Luke actually anticipates, her gift in the temple anticipates the sacrifice of Jesus. When Jesus himself gives everything to the Father, he places his entire life in the hands of the Father. Jesus is doing in a perfect way what this widow is doing in an anticipatory way. All right? And so the implication then is that God will value the gift of Jesus' life that he makes as an offering and sacrifice above all others. And that's ancient Christian teaching, isn't it? That the sacrifice of Jesus is the sacrifice that surpasses in value all others, all the sacrifices of the Old Testament, all the animal sacrifices, libations, cereal offerings, etc., that are behind the scenes here. That's why you have these donations being made in the temple. They are all surpassed by the one perfect sacrifice of his Son, Jesus Christ. And then finally, one of the more interesting readings of this passage is one that I put in the Ignatius Catholic Study Bible, where the Venerable Bede, who's a monk and a scholar writing in the early Middle Ages, the Venerable Bede compares the widow to the church. He sees her as an image of the church, because the church is wedded to Christ, and her husband, Jesus Christ, has died. He has perished on the cross, and that makes the church a widow. And so the church has to live her life in this world, separated from Jesus, at least in the sense that he has not yet come back to claim her. That the church lives in the world in poverty of spirit, obeying that first beatitude that Jesus enunciated on the Mount of Beatitudes in Galilee. But then also, the church is paying those 2 copper coins. And what are the 2 copper coins, according to the Venerable Bede? It's the double commandment of love, to love God and to love neighbor as yourself. Those are the 2 primary, the 2 premier commandments, according to Jesus. And that's what the church gives back to the Lord, her husband. All right? So I hope that some of these reflections here today were helpful to you. I pray that God will work in your life to show you where you can be more generous with him, where you can give an offering and a sacrifice that Jesus himself would stand there and praise before others. So thanks again for being with us, for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Thanks.